The airport smelled like cinnamon pretzels and fresh coffee. Sophie Langley stood by gate 18, her boarding pass clutched between her fingers, a worn leather tote hanging from one shoulder. Inside it, nestled between a paperback and her charger, was a manila folder containing something far more valuable than it looked. Her first published short story, printed and signed from the National Writing Contest she'd just won. She hadn't told many people, not her classmates, not even most of her extended family. Just her dad, of course. He was the one who said, "Write it your way. Don't ask for permission." Now, she was headed home to Boulder, Colorado. Her dad had insisted she fly first class this time. "For once, accept the comfort, kid," he'd said on the phone. Sophie didn't argue. But she also didn't wear anything flashy. Just jeans, a clean white sweater, and her beat-up Converse. She wasn't trying to look like anything. As the boarding group was called, Sophie moved toward the gate behind a man in a blazer and a woman wearing heels that clicked with authority. No one gave her a second glance, and she preferred it that way. She passed the security gate, greeted the attendant with a polite smile, and stepped into the quiet luxury of the jet bridge. Her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her tote. First class wasn't a foreign world, but it wasn't her usual one either. She'd been taught to say please and thank you, to never assume she belonged somewhere unless invited. But this ticket was hers. Paid for, valid, and real. In the distance, she spotted the sleek Crescent Air aircraft waiting under the floodlights. Her father had always liked the airline, said it had potential when others ignored it. She never imagined he'd buy into it, let alone take majority ownership, but that wasn't who Sophie was. She never led with his name. She liked being anonymous, being judged, if at all, on her own merit. As she stepped onto the plane, a calm settled in her chest. This was supposed to be an easy flight home. A quiet ride, maybe a nap, then hugs and pasta at home. She had no idea the next 3 hours would test everything her father ever taught her about dignity. And someone else on board was about to learn who she really was. Sophie eased into the plush leather armchair of the first-class lounge, letting out a slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Soft jazz played through overhead speakers, and a barista behind the counter poured lattes that smelled like vanilla and reassurance. For a moment, she allowed herself to sip the warmth in silence. Just then, 2 flight attendants in Navy uniforms drifted past. One was Kendra Blake, the lead attendant assigned to Sophie's flight. Kendra's uniform jacket fit her like armor, and her polished hair sat in a perfect twist at the back of her head. The other attendant, younger and more hesitant, glanced between Sophie and Kendra as if measuring something invisible. "Look at her," Kendra murmured, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the lounge's calm. "She doesn't look like she paid for first class." Her colleague nodded, eyes flicking to Sophie's scuffed sneakers and neat but casual sweater. They exchanged a small smirk, just enough that Sophie caught it from the corner of her eye. Her chest tightened. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. Simple, comfortable, professional. Nothing flashy or distracting. But the unspoken assumption still stung, that first class had an unspoken dress code she didn't meet. Sophie's fingers curled around the handle of her tote. Inside, the folder with her story felt heavier all of a sudden. This was supposed to be her prize, her reward for hard work, not something to hide beneath a dress code she never agreed to. She looked down at her boarding pass again. Crescent Air Flight 421, Seat 1A, valid and paid in full. The barcode was as real as the pulse in her wrist. She swallowed. "Excuse me," Sophie said softly, standing. "I believe this is my boarding pass?" Kendra turned instantly, her professional mask sliding into place. "Miss, first class is reserved for paying passengers only," she replied with a polite tilt of her chin. "Economy is just down the aisle." Sophie's heart thudded. Around her, travelers adjusted their bags, unaware or unwilling to notice. Nobody spoke up on her behalf. The hush of the lounge felt suddenly like a spotlight, but Sophie didn't waver. She pressed her finger gently on the barcode, then leveled her eyes with Kendra's. "I paid for this ticket," she said. "It's my seat." Kendra paused, jaw tightening. Sophie could see her colleague glance away, uncomfortable now that Sophie spoke up. A bead of sweat tickled Kendra's temple, proof that sometimes professionalism cracked under the right pressure. Sophie drew in a steady breath, remembering her dad's advice. Stand with grace, even when they doubt you. She tucked her chin up and nodded, waiting for Kendra's acknowledgement and whatever came next. Sophie hovered at the boarding door, her heart thudding in her chest like a silent alarm. The line had grown long behind her. Well-dressed business travelers, tired families clutching carry-ons, and a cluster of students laughing about weekend plans. Nobody looked at her twice, until Kendra Blake stepped into view. Kendra held up Sophie's boarding pass like it was a museum exhibit. Her tone was polite, but icy. "First class is reserved for paying passengers only," she announced, voice carrying over the small crowd. "Economy is just down the aisle." A ripple of surprised whispers spread behind Sophie. A businessman in a crisp suit raised an eyebrow. A mother with a toddler frowned, her lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came. A few travelers shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Sophie's handwritten pass and Kendra's steely stare. Sophie's throat went dry. She glanced down at her ticket again. Crescent Air Flight 421, Seat 1A. The ink was bold, the barcode unambiguous. She managed a quiet, "Please, could you try scanning it again?" Kendra's lips pressed into a thin line. Without a hint of hesitation, she tapped a few buttons on her tablet. "I don't see you in the system's first-class roster. Please step aside." The murmurs deepened. Some faces registered pity. A few nodded in sympathy, while others seemed smug, as though Sophie were simply trying to weasel an upgrade. Embarrassment coiled in her stomach. In that moment, Sophie felt smaller than the paper airplane she'd built as a child, crumpled and tossed aside. Yet she forced herself to stand tall. She cleared her throat. "I paid for this seat with my own account," she said evenly. "It's mine." Kendra's colleague shifted her weight, awkwardly avoiding eye contact. The younger attendant glanced at Sophie, then back at Kendra, silently urging her to relent. But Kendra merely smiled, a practiced curve that didn't reach her eyes, and shook her head. Sophie felt her cheeks warm. Every eye was on her now. She could almost taste the doubt. Did she really belong here? Was she in the wrong? But she remembered her dad's words. "Never let them decide your worth." A long beat passed. Finally, Sophie tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and said, voice steady, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking to sit where I'm supposed to." The gate agent shifted uncomfortably, fingers hovering over the intercom button. Kendra straightened her back, lips twitching as if savoring the moment. Sophie's pulse raced, but beneath it all, something settled. A quiet certainty that she wasn't going anywhere without her rightful seat. And as the line behind her pressed closer, the crowd's whispers swelled into a chorus of doubt and anticipation. Sophie's pulse roared in her ears as she watched the gate agent nod at Kendra Blake. The agent's polite smile didn't reach her eyes when she said, "I'm sorry, miss. Please follow our security escort to the economy cabin." A knot twisted in Sophie's stomach. She slid her tote off her shoulder and followed the two uniformed officers through the jet bridge. Each step felt like wading through quicksand. Slow, heavy, impossible to escape. Behind her, the line of first-class passengers kept moving, oblivious or unwilling to intervene. One of the officers, a tall man with a stoic expression, placed a firm hand on her elbow. "Just routine verification," he told her, voice low. "Nothing to worry about." But Sophie knew better. The echo of Kendra's last words rang in her mind. "We'll sort out the mistake later." The later felt like a scar, a promise of shame deferred, not erased. They reached the cabin door. Above it, gold lettering read, "First Class," in elegant script. Sophie took a shaky breath, then descended the steps into the aisle. The plush seats and ambient lighting were immediately left behind, replaced by the narrower rows of economy and overhead bins jammed with carry-ons. Passengers gave her curious glances, some sympathetic, some disapproving, a few looking as though they were silently agreeing with Kendra's judgment. She swallowed hard and kept walking. The officers flanked her, scanning their tablets as though they expected an error to magically appear. A woman in a business suit shifted in her seat and shot Sophie an apologetic look, but made no move to help. Sophie's throat felt raw, her cheeks hot. It was the first time she'd ever felt so exposed, like a spotlight had been trained on her humiliation. The officers finally released her by seat 27D. "Here you go," the female officer said, handing back her boarding pass with a curt nod. Sophie's fingers trembled as she retrieved it and checked the assignment. Yes, seat 27D, economy. Valid and final. Sophie nodded quietly and forced herself to sit. She tucked the story folder into her lap as if it could shield her from the sting of judgment around her. A child 2 rows forward peeked back, eyes wide with concern, then scurried away. The overhead bins slammed shut as the cabin door sealed. She took a deep breath, steadying her shoulders. In that moment, she realized that humiliation was not permission to break. Instead of tears, she felt a fierce resolve ignite in her chest. Whatever came next, she would meet it with grace and with the quiet confidence her father taught her. She tapped on her phone, no message this time, just a slow exhale. The flight was only beginning. Sophie nestled into her new seat in the back of the cabin, finding the narrow economy row quieter now that boarding had finished. The overhead bins clicked shut, flight attendants zipped past with carts, and the hum of passengers settling filled the air. She patted the leather armrest lightly, then slid her hand into her tote to pull out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She thought about typing out all the details, how Kendra had called security, how strangers stared, how her cheeks burned with humiliation. But none of that mattered. She needed her dad to know, and she knew exactly what to say. "Dad? They moved me to economy. She said I didn't belong." She hit send and tucked the phone back against her sweater. A flutter of anxiety tickled her stomach, but beneath it, an odd sense of calm. This wasn't the first time she'd faced doubt, but somehow, admitting it to him felt like the first real step forward. Up front, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the runway lights, Lucas Langley paused mid-sentence. He'd been walking the Crescent Air directors through the rollout of a new cabin monitoring system, ClearDeck Protocol, designed precisely for moments like this. He waved away a question about scheduling, his gaze fixed on the glow of his phone. He unlocked the message and his calm demeanor shifted. The gentle curve of his lips flattened, and a quiet steel entered his eyes. He excused himself from the table and stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Back in row 27D, Sophie stared out the small oval window at the dark tarmac. Flashes of distant headlights blurred on the wet runway surface. A single drop of tension crawled down her spine. She felt momentarily exposed. No plush seats, no muted jazz, just her and a crowd that didn't understand her worth. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. "Stay calm, I've got this." Her chest lifted at the words. She pressed her palm to her heart, steadying the rapid beat. He was on it. She wasn't alone. Behind the scenes, Lucas slipped into the cockpit to make his call, one that would pivot the entire flight's course. But Sophie didn't know the details yet. All she felt was that familiar warmth, the unspoken promise that her dignity wouldn't be left to the mercy of someone else's assumptions. She exhaled, returning her gaze to the seat in front of her. The flight was still underway, and whatever was coming next, she knew she'd face it, in the calm confidence her dad always insisted she carry, even when the world tried to knock her down. Lucas Langley leaned back in his leather chair, the low hum of the boardroom's air system mingling with the soft click of presentation slides advancing behind him. Crescent Air's directors sat in a semicircle, pens poised over notebooks, eyes on his PowerPoint outlining the new ClearDeck protocol, a live cabin monitoring system designed to catch any service breakdown in real time. He clicked the remote, but his mind wasn't on the slide ahead. A vibration sounded from his phone on the polished walnut table. A message from Sophie. 4 simple words glowing on the screen. "Dad, they moved me." The room fell away. Lucas muted the microphone, smiled politely, and said, "Excuse me a moment." He rose smoothly, smoothing his dark blazer, and stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him. Out of view of the directors, he unlocked his phone. The follow-up text read, "Economy cabin." She said, "I didn't belong." His jaw set. In his hand, the phone felt both heavy and necessary, a lifeline. He sent one reply. "I've got this. Activate ClearDeck now." He pocketed the phone and strode to the executive elevator. As the doors slid closed, he tapped out a secure code on his smartwatch. Moments later, a signal flashed on a console in the cockpit of Flight 421. Red alert. ClearDeck protocol engaged. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, Lucas had slipped from the role of chairman back into the role of profoundly protective father. He passed through security with his corporate badge. No fanfare, no announcements. Just a man on a mission, quietly commandeering the system he'd spent months refining. Up in 30,000 feet, in the narrow confines of the cockpit, Captain Rivera glanced at the glowing alert on the console. Protocol guidelines flashed. Priority: identify and rectify any passenger service infraction. Await instructions from Chairman. The captain tapped the intercom button. His voice, calm but unmistakable, filled the cabin. "This is Captain Rivera. By direct order of Chairman Langley, we are enacting the ClearDeck protocol. Further announcement shortly." In that instant, from a hidden control room at Denver HQ to the jetliner humming over the Midwest, the power structure shifted. What had begun as an awkward error at Gate 18 was now a matter of corporate principle and personal dignity. Lucas Langley, unseen but unshakable, had just thrown the first domino. The rest of the flight would never be the same. The cabin lights were dimmed for takeoff, but Sophie's eyes remained wide open, fixed on the row ahead. The announcement had barely faded when she felt it. A subtle shift in the air. Kendra Blake was walking past her section, but something was off. Her steps, once precise and assured, now hovered between haste and hesitation. Across the aisle, a fellow passenger frowned at the lead attendant's uneven gait, then leaned toward his neighbor. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "She looks nervous." The neighbor nodded, adjusting his collar. A flight attendant pushing a drinks cart slowed down as Kendra approached, exchanging a quick, concerned glance. Sophie, seated in 3C, settled back against the headrest. She had subconsciously straightened her posture, shoulders squared and chin lifted. A calm determination had replaced the knot of humiliation in her chest. Inside, her mind replayed her father's text. "I've got this." She wasn't about to let Kendra's doubts rattle her. From her vantage point, Sophie watched as Kendra paused by a business traveler, forcing an overly bright smile. The traveler asked for sparkling water, and Kendra's response came out clipped, almost reflexive. She fumbled for the bottle before setting it down with a tremor in her fingers, a tiny crack in her polished facade. A teenager ahead of Sophie nudged his sister. "Why's she acting weird?" he asked quietly. Sophie glanced at them, offering a small, reassuring smile. No words were needed. The look said, "It's okay." When Kendra moved on, the siblings exchanged puzzled looks before returning to their phones. Sophie tucked her story folder into her lap and took a slow breath. Each inhale grounded her. Each exhale reminded her of her father's silent support. She had weathered harsher storms, late-night deadlines, harsh critiques, and emerged stronger every time. This humiliation was unfair, but it would be her catalyst, not her crisis. Moments later, Kendra paused in the aisle opposite row 3, glancing down at Sophie, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Their eyes met for a split second. Sophie held her gaze steadily, her voice silent but resolute. In that instant, Kendra's expression flickered. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by uncertainty. The tension rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged curious glances, the hum of the engines punctuated by quiet speculation. Sophie felt the tide turning. The same crowd that had once doubted her now watched Kendra's faltering confidence, and by extension, saw Sophie in a new light. As the flight climbed through the clouds, Sophie closed her eyes for a brief moment, savoring the calm. She knew the next move would come from above, from the unseen but powerful hand her father had already set in motion. And she was ready. The cabin had settled into a steady hum, engines purring, murmured conversations floating through the dimmed lighting. Sophie Langley leaned back in 3C, her fingers tracing the edge of her story folder, when Captain Rivera's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the lull. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. By direct order of Chairman Langley and under our Clear Deck protocol, lead flight attendant Kendra Blake is immediately suspended from duty. Please remain seated while we address this matter. Thank you." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, silence. Eyes snapped toward the front of the cabin. Kendra, halfway through serving a glass of champagne, froze, her hand trembling around the stem. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Her cheeks lost whatever color they'd had. The blanket of confidence she'd worn evaporated in that single announcement. Sophie felt her chest expand, not with triumph, but with quiet relief. She met Kendra's eyes for a moment, no gloating, only unwavering composure. It was as if the words had peeled away the last trace of Kendra's arrogance, exposing raw insecurity. A tentative round of applause began in the back rows, growing as it rolled forward. A businessman patted Sophie's shoulder, whispering, "Well deserved." A mother in row 5 wiped away a misty eye, nodding in solidarity. Even the younger attendant, who had once flinched at Sophie's presence, let out a soft cheer. Kendra stood rooted to the spot, her uniform suddenly ill-fitting, her posture slumped. Passengers craned their necks, some pulling out phones, unsure whether to record or just bear witness. She opened her mouth. No words came. The intercom fell silent again, leaving only the echo of her own heartbeat. In that charged stillness, Sophie realized that justice can arrive as a whisper over a speaker, not a shout. She wasn't the one celebrating. She simply allowed herself to breathe in the moment, to feel the dignity restored. Her father's unseen hand had shifted the balance, but her own grace had set the stage. As Kendra was gently guided away by a fellow attendant, Sophie straightened her shoulders. The cabin returned to its rhythm. Clinking glasses, soft laughter. But something fundamental had changed. This wasn't just about one ticket or one flight. It was a message. Respect isn't optional, and silence can be the most powerful form of resistance. Sophie slid her folder back into her tote and pressed her palms together, a quiet prayer of thanks. The flight still had miles to go, but she knew she'd faced the storm and emerged with her dignity intact. Proof that sometimes the right call speaks louder than any words. Kendra Blake's steps felt like they were on slow motion as she was gently guided down the aisle toward row 3. The hush that followed the intercom announcement had settled into a heavy silence, passengers craning their necks, phones raised hesitantly, as though afraid to witness what came next. Sophie Langley sat in 3C, her posture perfectly calm, hands folded neatly in her lap. Kendra reached Sophie's seat and came to an abrupt halt. Her uniform jacket felt too tight, her crisp collar suddenly scratchy against her throat. She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking from the floor to Sophie's clear, measured eyes. For a moment, nobody spoke. The cabin lights cast soft halos over unsettled faces, and even the flight attendants paused, frozen like statues. Then, without warning, a built-in screen above the galley flickered on. The camera feed split. In one window, the cockpit. In the other, a familiar office bathed in warm lamplight. And there, center frame, was Lucas Langley, Sophie's father, chairman of Crescent Air. His expression was steady, his tone calm but absolute. "Ms. Blake," his voice carried through the cabin speakers, "you have humiliated my daughter in front of these passengers. Under the Clear Deck Protocol, your suspension has been enacted. This company stands for respect and dignity. Values you've violated. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately." A collective gasp rolled through the first-class cabin, followed by a ripple of applause that felt both triumphal and tender. Kendra's knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrest. She opened her mouth, closed it. There was nowhere to go, no excuse to offer. Sophie's heart thudded once, softly, with a strange sort of peace. She met Kendra's eyes, not with anger or gloating, but with a quiet steadiness that spoke volumes. "I stood my ground. I did nothing wrong." In that shared glance, Sophie felt the full circle of her father's protection and her own unshakable dignity. Behind them, a flight attendant stepped forward with a discreet nod. Kendra released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her face paled, her carefully constructed composure unraveling in real time. With a polite but strained nod to the cabin, she turned and walked toward the rear exit, her heels clicking softly as the cabin watched in respectful silence. Sophie allowed herself the smallest of smiles before looking away, tucking her folder back into her tote. Around her, murmurs of support and relief swirled softly. No cheering, no spectacle, just the warm hum of people acknowledging that justice had been quietly, firmly done. As the screen behind her went dark, Sophie settled back into her seat. She drew in a slow breath, her chest swelling with relief and gratitude. The storm had passed, and she'd remained steady throughout. A ripple of stunned silence lingered for a heartbeat after Kendra Blake's heels faded down the aisle. Then the cabin erupted into applause. It started low and polite, like hesitant raindrops, then swelled into a thunderous ovation that filled every corner of the first-class cabin. Sophie Langley felt each clap roll over her in waves of warmth. A sharply dressed businessman in row 2 leaned across the aisle and patted her shoulder gently. "You handled that beautifully," he murmured, eyes shining. Sophie offered him a small, grateful smile. She felt the tension loosen in her chest for the first time since boarding. Behind her, a mother in row 5 dabbed at her eyes with a neat blue scarf, nodding in solidarity. "I'm so sorry you went through that," the woman whispered, voice thick with empathy. Sophie's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how hungry she was for that human connection, that simple acknowledgement that she wasn't alone. Even the youngest flight attendant, the one who'd glanced away when Sophie first tried to board, broke into a quiet cheer. She pressed a hand over her heart as she watched Sophie, as if her own guilt and doubt had flipped into relief. The cabin crew exchanged glances, their earlier composure replaced by genuine respect. Sophie took in the scene, passengers leaning forward in their seats, phones stowed and forgotten, all eyes on her. It wasn't showboating or melodrama. It was collective validation. She realized this moment was about more than one girl's ticket. It was about standing up when no one else would, and the simple power of a community recognizing justice. Somewhere in the back, a cluster of economy passengers who'd been watching through the curtain's gap broke into applause too. Modest, but heartfelt. A college student gave her a thumbs up, and Sophie responded with a nod that felt like a bridge between two worlds. The intercom remained silent now, but the unspoken message echoed louder than any announcement could. Respect mattered. Dignity mattered. And no matter how quietly she'd insisted on her place, the cabin had answered loudly. Sophie's gaze drifted to the empty aisle where Kendra had stood. No hint of spite flitted across her thoughts, only a calm resolve. She'd won, not by force, but by refusing to retreat. That resilience was the real celebration today. As the applause tapered into warm murmurs and soft smiles, Sophie settled back in her seat. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting the eyes of strangers who'd become her allies. And in that moment, she felt something new blossom inside her. A quiet certainty that she was worthy of every right she'd claimed. And that dignity, once restored, shone brighter than any spotlight. A few minutes after the applause died down, a soft chime sounded at Sophie's seat. The curtain to first class parted, and the junior attendant, eyes bright, offered her a gentle smile. "Miss Langley, you're invited back to your original seat in first class with our deepest apologies." Sophie glanced at the plush leather and soft ambient lighting beyond the curtain. It would have been easy to slide back into 1A to reclaim what she'd already paid for. But she shook her head, voice calm and steady. "Thank you, but I'm fine here." The attendant nodded, admiration in her eyes. Sophie settled back, hands folded in her lap. Around her, passengers leaned in, as though they were witnessing something quietly profound. A grandmother in the seat behind gave a thumbs up. A man in the row across saluted with his teacup. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a warm glow spread through her chest. She hadn't needed to demand her place or wield her father's power to win. Instead, she'd held her ground with dignity, letting grace speak louder than anger. When the attendant returned to her duties, the cabin felt different. Softer somehow, more connected. Sophie tapped out a quick note on her phone. "You did it, Dad." And as the plane cruised on, she realized that true victory wasn't about reclaiming a seat. It was about standing tall without resentment and showing others the quiet strength that lives in forgiveness. After landing, the cabin door opened to a sea of curious faces. A discreet announcement followed. Crescent Air would implement mandatory in-flight cabin monitoring on every flight, part of the clear deck protocol Lucas Langley championed. Staff training on respect and unconscious bias would be required before any crew member returned to duty. No press conference, no grand speeches, just a short, honest message on the airline's site. At Crescent Air, every passenger deserves dignity. We're committed to ensuring that respect is never optional. Meanwhile, Kendra Blake's status read terminated in internal bulletins. She later received an offer: complete diversity and empathy training, then reapply under strict probation. Few would give her a second chance, but the door wasn't slammed shut forever. As for Sophie, she stepped off the plane into the warm Colorado sunlight, her father waiting with open arms. She clutched her manila folder, now filled with fresh notes for her next story. The flight had tested her poise, but it also lit a spark. She realized words could change more than paper. Back at her desk in Boulder, Sophie opened a blank document and wrote the first line of her new chapter. Today, I learned that standing tall with grace can shift an entire world. A soft smile curved her lips. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a storyteller. Armed with truth and quiet strength,